In the winter of 1942, a cargo ship called the SS Schenectady sat at the fitting-out dock in Portland, Oregon. She had been launched the day before. Her hull was freshly painted. Her engines had passed their trials. She was ready for sea. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, with the air temperature below freezing and the hull steel cold enough to ache against a bare hand, the ship broke in half. There was no collision, no torpedo, no storm. The ship was tied to the dock, motionless in calm water. The hull simply cracked, a fracture that began at a stress point near the superstructure and propagated across the deck and down both sides of the hull with a sound that witnesses described as a rifle shot amplified to the volume of thunder. The bow and stern sections sagged away from each other, held together only by the bottom plating of the keel. The ship folded like a book. No one was killed, the crew evacuated. The wreck was examined, photographed, analyzed, and argued over for months. The traditional shipbuilders, the men who had warned from the beginning that these ships were being built too fast by people who didn't know what they were doing, said it proved their point. You could not build a ship in weeks when it should take months. You could not replace rivets with welds. You could not send women and farm hands to do the work of trained shipwrights and expect the result to float. The man who had built the Schenectady, and who would, by the end of the war, build more ships than any person in history, was not a shipbuilder. He had never built a ship before 1941. He was a dam builder, a road builder, a man who had spent his career pouring concrete in places where no one had poured concrete before. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. The Navy did not want him. The Maritime Commission did not trust him. The traditional shipbuilding industry considered him an ignorant outsider. He built 1,490 ships. He built them faster than anyone thought possible. He changed the way America manufactured everything. And the ships he built, ugly, slow, underpowered, and absolutely essential, carried the war across 2 oceans and won it. The arithmetic of the Atlantic War in 1941 was simple and terrifying. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, after the United States entered the war, U-boats sank over 3 million tons of shipping. 3 million tons! That is roughly 500 ships, each one carrying food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, and the 1,000 other commodities that an army needs to fight. Every ship that sank took its cargo to the bottom. Every cargo that went to the bottom was a cargo that did not reach Britain or North Africa or the Soviet Union. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding the German submarine fleet, understood the tonnage war with the clarity of a mathematician. He did not need to sink every ship. He needed to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. If the loss rate exceeded the construction rate, the available merchant tonnage would shrink month by month until it fell below the level needed to sustain the war effort. Below that level, Britain would begin to starve. The armies in North Africa would run out of ammunition. The Soviet convoys through Murmansk would stop. The war would slowly strangle. Britain was an island. It imported everything, 60% of its food, all of its oil, most of its raw materials. If the shipping stopped, Britain starved. Churchill himself said after the war that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. If Britain starved, there was no base from which to invade Europe. If there was no invasion of Europe, Germany won. The United States was building merchant ships. The Maritime Commission, under Rear Admiral Emory S. Land, had been expanding the merchant fleet since the late 1930s. But the ships being built were modern turbine-powered vessels, C-class cargo ships with high-pressure steam plants and reduction gearing that required specialized manufacturing. The turbines were excellent, the ships were fast, and there were nowhere near enough of them because the turbines took months to build and the reduction gears required precision machining that only a handful of American factories could perform. The bottleneck was not steel, it was not labor, it was the engines. America could pour steel and train welders. It could not conjure turbines and reduction gears from nothing. The solution came from Britain, and it came in the form of a ship that the American naval establishment found embarrassing. In 1940, the British government placed an order with American shipyards for 60 cargo ships to replace merchant tonnage lost to U-boats. The design was based on a pre-war British tramp steamer, the SS Dorrington Court, built in 1939 by J.L. Thompson & Sons in Sunderland, on the River Wear. Thompson's yard had been building ships since 1846. The Dorrington Court was their standard tramp, a workmanlike cargo vessel designed for economy, not elegance. No turbines, no reduction gears, no high-pressure boilers. Instead, a single triple-expansion reciprocating steam engine, a technology that dated to the 1880s, producing 2,500 horsepower and pushing the ship through the water at 11 knots. This was slow. A modern C-class cargo ship could do 15 or 16 knots. 11 knots was barely faster than a First World War freighter. The American naval architects at the Maritime Commission looked at the British design and saw obsolescence. The triple-expansion engine was a museum piece. The hull design was adequate but uninspired. The ship was, by every measure of modern naval engineering, a step backward. But that step backward was exactly what the moment demanded. The triple-expansion engine could be built by any competent machine shop in America, using technology that was 60 years old and required no exotic materials, no precision gearing, no specialized manufacturing that was already committed to warship production. The boilers were simple fire tube designs, oil-fired instead of the British coal-fired originals, producible in enormous quantities by any of the dozens of boilermakers across the country. The hull was a standard cargo ship form. No radical hydrodynamics, no tricky curves, just steel plates welded to steel frames in shapes that any shipfitter could understand. The Americans modified the design. Gibbs & Cox, the naval architecture firm in New York, adapted the plans for American construction practices, combining the split superstructure into a single island amidships, changing the scantling dimensions to match American steel standards, and expanding the drawings from the minimal documentation that British shipyards traditionally worked with into the comprehensive plans that American mass production required. The result was designated the EC-2S C1. The ships would be 441 feet long, with a beam of 57 feet, a deadweight tonnage of 10,856 tons, and a service speed of 11 knots. Each would cost approximately $2 million. Roosevelt saw one of the early models and called it a dreadful-looking object. Admiral Land referred to them as ugly ducklings. The press mocked the design. A ship powered by an engine from the 19th century in 1941? On September 27, 1941, the first ship, named Patrick Henry after the revolutionary who said, "Give me liberty or death," was launched. Admiral Land, seeking to improve the ship's image, declared the launch day Liberty Fleet Day. The name stuck. The ugly duckling became the Liberty ship. Henry John Kaiser was born in Sprout Brook, New York, a hamlet in the Mohawk Valley, the son of German immigrants. His father was a shoemaker. His mother died when he was young. He left school at 13 to work as a cash boy in a dry goods store in Utica. By his 20s, he was in the construction business, starting with a road paving company in Washington State. By his 40s, he was one of the most successful heavy construction contractors in the United States, having built roads across the Pacific Northwest, portions of the levee system on the Mississippi, and, most famously, having led the 6 companies consortium that built the Hoover Dam, the Bonneville Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam. Kaiser was not an engineer, he was an organizer. He was a man who understood logistics, labor management, material flow, and the art of delivering enormous projects on time and under budget. He was also, by every account, an extraordinarily persuasive person, a man who could walk into a room full of skeptics and walk out with a contract. He had a gift for making the impossible sound merely difficult, and the difficult sound routine. He had never built a ship. He had never worked in a shipyard. He knew nothing about naval architecture, marine engineering, lofting, hull fairing, or the centuries-old traditions of the shipbuilding trade. What he knew was concrete, steel, schedules, and how to move 10,000 men and 1,000,000 tons of material to the right place at the right time. When the Maritime Commission began looking for companies to build Liberty ships, the traditional shipbuilders of the East Coast, Bethlehem Steel, New York Shipbuilding, Newport News, Bath Iron Works, assumed they would get the contracts. They had the expertise, they had the facilities, they had the trained workforce. They had been building ships for decades, in some cases for a century. They were the American shipbuilding industry. Kaiser did not wait to be invited. He proposed building entirely new shipyards on the West Coast, purpose-built facilities designed from the ground up for mass production. Not shipyards in the traditional sense, where skilled craftsmen assembled ships one at a time using methods unchanged since the age of iron hulls. Production lines, assembly plants, factories that happened to produce ships instead of automobiles. The reaction from the established industry ranged from skepticism to hostility. Rear Admiral Vickery of the Maritime Commission privately referred to Kaiser as a headline hunter. Traditional shipbuilders warned that a dam builder had no business constructing ocean-going vessels. The craft unions feared the dilution of their skilled trades. The Navy's Bureau of Ships questioned whether welded hulls could withstand the stresses of ocean service. It was, the experts agreed, a recipe for disaster. Kaiser built 7 shipyards, 4 in Richmond, California, and 3 in the Portland-Vancouver area of Oregon and Washington. Each yard was designed around the principles of modular construction and assembly line production that Henry Ford had applied to automobiles 30 years earlier. But Kaiser's innovation went further than Ford's because a ship is not a car. A ship is 441 feet long. It weighs 14,000 tons when fully loaded. It cannot roll down an assembly line. The assembly line must come to the ship. The revolution was conceptual before it was mechanical. Traditional shipbuilding started at the keel and built upward, fitting each piece to the one below it, adjusting and adapting as the ship grew. This required skilled workers at every stage, men who understood how hull plates curved, how frames aligned, how rivets held, how the complex three-dimensional geometry of a ship's hull could be translated from a lofting floor drawing to a real object made of steel. The process was sequential and organic. You could not install the deck until the hull was complete. You could not fit the superstructure until the deck was in place. Each step depended on the one before it, and the accumulated skill of the workforce was embedded in every joint. Kaiser threw this away. His engineers divided the ship into approximately 250 prefabricated sections, modules that were built simultaneously in workshops scattered around the yard, then lifted into position by cranes and welded together on the building ways. The bow section was being constructed in one workshop, while the engine room section was being built in another, and the stern section in a third. Deck houses were assembled complete with wiring, piping, and fixtures in a fourth. When all the sections were ready, they were carried to the ways on rail cars and assembled like pieces of an enormous steel puzzle. This approach had 3 advantages that the traditional builders underestimated. First, it allowed work to proceed in parallel rather than in sequence, collapsing the construction timeline from months to weeks. Second, it moved much of the work from the open building ways, where workers were exposed to rain, wind, and the awkward geometry of a curving hull, into covered workshops where conditions were controlled and the work could be performed at bench height. Third, and most important, it allowed less skilled workers to perform individual tasks that, in total, produced a complex result. A welder did not need to understand the entire ship. She needed to understand her section, her joints, her welds. The intelligence was in the system, not in the individual. The emphasis on welding rather than riveting was the single most consequential technical decision of the Liberty ship program. A riveted joint required a team of 4 men, a heater who warmed the rivet in a forge, a catcher who caught the thrown rivet in a bucket, a bucker who held the rivet in place with a heavy bar, and a riveter who hammered the hot rivet into its final shape. This was skilled, coordinated, physically exhausting work. A welded joint required one person with an electric arc welder and a few weeks of training. The reduction in labor was dramatic. Welding accounted for much of the speed advantage that Kaiser's yards achieved over traditional shipbuilders. Kaiser established training schools at each yard. A new worker received 2 to 6 weeks of instruction in a specific skill: flat welding, vertical welding, overhead welding, burning, flame cutting, fitting, and was then assigned to a production team. The training was narrowly focused. The worker learned one skill and performed that skill repeatedly, 8 to 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The cumulative effect of thousands of workers, each performing a single task with increasing speed and precision, was a production system that improved continuously. The results astonished the world, and they astonished Kaiser himself, who had predicted fast construction but had not anticipated how fast. The first Liberty ship, Patrick Henry, took 244 days from keel laying to delivery. This was already faster than conventional shipbuilding, which typically required 6 to 12 months for a comparable vessel. But Kaiser was just warming up. His yards learned, they optimized, they eliminated bottlenecks, they moved the welds to the workshops and the workshops closer to the ways. Within months, the construction time had fallen to 60 days, then 45, then 30. A fierce competition developed between Kaiser's yards and the other emergency shipyards, a competition that Kaiser encouraged because competition produced speed, and speed produced ships, and ships produced victory. The Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation Yard in Portland launched a ship, the SS Joseph N. Teal, in just 10 days from keel laying to delivery. This was already faster than conventional shipbuilding, which typically required 6 to 12 months for a comparable vessel. But Kaiser was just warming up. His yards learned, they optimized, they eliminated bottlenecks, they moved the welds to the workshops and the workshops closer to the ways. Within months, the construction time had fallen to 60 days, then 45, then 30. A record was a publicity stunt. The components had been prefabricated and staged in advance, and every worker in the yard was assigned to the single ship. But it demonstrated a principle that was not a stunt at all, that shipbuilding could be reduced to an industrial process as predictable and as scalable as automobile manufacturing. By 1943, Kaiser's 7 yards were launching a new ship every single day, one per day, 7 days a week for months on end. The average time from keel to delivery across all of Kaiser's yards settled at approximately 42 days, still remarkable for a 441-foot ocean-going vessel. The speed of construction meant that the Liberty ship production rate eventually exceeded the U-boat sinking rate. This was the tipping point of the Battle of the Atlantic. In the early months of 1942, the U-boats were winning, sinking ships faster than anyone could build them. By mid-1943, the shipyards had pulled ahead. The gap between losses and replacements narrowed, then reversed. The merchant fleet grew even as the U-boats continued to attack. Across 18 shipyards on the East, West, and Gulf coasts, a total of 2,710 Liberty ships were built between 1941 and 1945. Kaiser's yards alone produced 821 of them, roughly 30% of the total, plus 219 of the improved Victory ships that followed. In all, Kaiser's shipyards launched 1,490 vessels of all types during the war. The total cost of the Liberty ship program was approximately $3.5 billion, roughly $65 billion in today's money. The average cost per ship declined from $2 million in 1941 to approximately $1.5 million by 1944 as production efficiencies accumulated. The workforce that built the Liberty ships was unlike any labor force in the history of American manufacturing. It was, in miniature, the entire social transformation of wartime America, compressed into a few square miles of waterfront. Kaiser recruited aggressively from across the country. Trains, special trains chartered by the company, carried workers from the rural South, the industrial Midwest, and the small towns of the Great Plains to the shipyards of Richmond and Portland. Many had never seen an ocean. Many had never seen a city larger than the county seat. Many had never worked in a factory, never used a power tool, never worn a hard hat. They came because the pay was good, Shipyard wages were among the highest in wartime industry, sometimes $5 or $6 a day when a farm laborer might earn $2. And because the work was available, and because the alternative for many of them was the draft. The demographic transformation was profound and, in the context of 1940s America, revolutionary. In 1941, American shipbuilding was a white, male, craft-based industry rooted in the guild traditions of the 19th century. By 1943, Kaiser's yards employed tens of thousands of women, tens of thousands of African Americans, and workers of backgrounds so varied that the shipyard cafeterias served as a cross-section of the American population in a way that almost no other institution of the era could match. Richmond, California, a small town of 23,000 before the war, swelled to over 100,000 as workers poured in from every state. The population tripled, then quadrupled. Housing could not keep pace. Workers lived in trailer parks, rooming houses, converted garages, and hastily constructed dormitories that were barely habitable. Crime increased. Racial tensions, always present in American life, but now compressed into an overcrowded, overheated boomtown, flared repeatedly. Kaiser, recognizing that an unhealthy or demoralized workforce was an unproductive workforce, responded with an approach that was years ahead of its time. He built his own hospitals, staffed by his own doctors, offering prepaid medical care to workers and their families for a weekly payroll deduction. The Kaiser Permanente Health Plan, today one of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States, serving over 12 million members, began as a prepaid medical program for shipyard workers in Richmond and Portland. He built child care centers, 24-hour facilities that allowed mothers to work any shift, knowing their children were fed, supervised, and safe. The child care centers were designed by architects and staffed by trained professionals. They were among the most advanced early childhood facilities in the country. The women who welded the hulls of Liberty ships became cultural icons, though the reality was more complex than the poster image suggested. They did not merely fill in while the men were away, they excelled. Production records from Kaiser's yards showed that female welders, once trained, produced work that was statistically indistinguishable in quality from male welders, and that in some categories, consistency, defect rate, and attendance, the women outperformed the men. They worked 10-hour shifts 6 days a week in conditions that were noisy, dirty, physically demanding, and occasionally dangerous. The arc flash from a welding torch could blind an unprotected eye, and the fumes from burning flux accumulated in confined spaces. They did it because the work needed doing, and because they were good at it, and because nobody had ever given them the chance to prove it before. The Liberty ships were not perfect. They were, in certain conditions, fatally flawed. And the flaw was invisible until it killed. Beginning in 1943, reports began to reach the Maritime Commission of Liberty ships developing cracks, sometimes small fractures in the deck plating that could be repaired at sea with a welding torch, sometimes catastrophic failures that split the hull from gunwale to keel in seconds. During the war, there were nearly 1,500 instances of significant brittle fracture in Liberty ships and the related T2 tankers that used similar construction methods. 12 ships broke completely in half. 3 of those sinkings resulted in loss of life, including the SS John P. Gaines, which broke apart and sank in the North Pacific on November 24, 1943, killing 10 of her crew of 41. The most dramatic failure was the SS Schenectady, the ship that had broken at the dock in Portland, calmly, without warning, while tied up and motionless. The crack had started at a notch where a deck plate met the superstructure, a point of stress concentration that the designers had not anticipated. The temperature was below freezing. The steel, which had been ductile and tough when it left the rolling mill, had become brittle in the cold. The crack propagated at the speed of sound through the steel, 3,000 meters per second, crossing the deck and running down both sides of the hull before anyone aboard understood what was happening. The sound was described by witnesses as a single enormous crack, like a giant pistol shot. The initial blame fell on the shipyards, on Kaiser and his methods, on the inexperienced workers, on the speed of construction, on the welding that had replaced riveting. The traditional shipbuilders, who had warned from the start that the Liberty ship program was reckless, pointed to the Schenectady and the other failures as proof that their warnings had been justified. "You cannot build a ship in 10 days," they said, "and expect it to survive the North Atlantic. You cannot replace a century of riveting knowledge with a few weeks of welding school and expect the result to hold together." They were wrong about the cause. The cracks did not start in the welds. They started in the steel. Constance Tipper, a metallurgist at Cambridge University, was tasked by the British Admiralty Ship Welding Committee to investigate the failures. Tipper was an extraordinary scientist, one of the first women to earn a degree in engineering at Imperial College London, and one of the first to use scanning electron microscopy for metallurgical research. Her investigation of the Liberty ship failures would become the foundation of an entirely new engineering discipline. Tipper identified the true culprit. The grade of steel used in Liberty ship construction underwent a ductile to brittle transition at temperatures that the ships routinely encountered in North Atlantic service. Above a certain temperature, the ductile to brittle transition temperature, or DBTT, the steel was tough and flexible. It would bend under stress without cracking. It would absorb energy. It was safe. Below that temperature, the same steel became brittle. It lost its ability to absorb energy. It cracked like glass. And the transition was sudden, not a gradual weakening, but an abrupt change in behavior that occurred over a narrow temperature range. The critical insight was the interaction between the steel's brittleness and the welded construction. In a riveted ship, a crack that started at a stress point would propagate until it reached a rivet hole, where the discontinuity in the plate would stop it. The rivet holes acted as crack arresters, natural barriers that contained the damage. In a welded ship, the hull was continuous steel, one unbroken surface from bow to stern. A crack that started at a stress concentration, typically the square corner of a cargo hatch, where the geometry focused stress like a lens focuses light, could propagate across the entire hull without interruption. The solution was implemented in stages, each one building on the understanding that Tipper's research provided. In the immediate term, the Maritime Commission ordered crack arresters, heavy steel straps, thicker than the hull plating, welded across the deck and hull at intervals. These straps created deliberate discontinuities in the hull surface that would stop a running crack before it could complete the circuit of the ship. The square hatch corners, the primary stress concentrations that initiated most of the cracks, were rounded, replacing the sharp 90-degree corners with radiused curves that distributed the stress over a larger area. Improved welding procedures were mandated, higher preheat temperatures that reduced residual stress in the weld zone, better electrode selection, lower hydrogen content in the welding consumables, and more rigorous inspection using X-ray and magnetic particle techniques. These modifications did not eliminate the cracking problem entirely. Ships continued to develop cracks throughout the war, but they reduced its severity to manageable levels. The crack arresters worked. Ships cracked, but they did not break in half. The cracks were contained, repaired at the next port, and the ships returned to service. In the long term, Constance Tipper's research transformed materials science. The Tipper test, a standardized Charpy impact test performed at multiple temperatures to determine the ductile to brittle transition temperature of a steel sample, became a foundational specification in structural engineering. After the war, every steel intended for use in welded structures, ships, bridges, buildings, pressure vessels, pipelines, was tested for its transition temperature and specified to perform ductilely at the lowest expected service temperature. The science of fracture mechanics, the mathematical study of how cracks form, how they propagate through materials under stress, and how they can be predicted and arrested, traces its modern origins directly to the Liberty ship failures. Every welded steel structure built since 1945, every supertanker, every offshore platform, every nuclear pressure vessel is designed with Tipper's findings embedded in its specifications. The Liberty ships that cracked in the North Atlantic in 1943 taught the engineering world something it had never fully understood, that a material's behavior in a laboratory test does not predict its behavior in service. The tests were incomplete. Constance Tipper completed them. A Liberty ship could carry 10,800 tons of cargo in its 5 holds and on its deck. To put that in terms that have meaning, one Liberty ship could carry 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition, or enough sea rations to feed an entire infantry division for 30 days. The ships carried everything the war consumed: tanks, trucks, half-tracks, ambulances, bulldozers, ammunition of every caliber, aviation gasoline and drums, diesel fuel, lubricating oil, food, canned, dried, frozen, medical supplies, whole blood in refrigerated containers, clothing, boots, helmets, tents, barbed wire, telephone wire, railroad locomotives, sections of prefabricated bridges, steel landing mats for airfield construction, and, in one memorable instance, an entire disassembled oil refinery. If the Allied armies needed it, a Liberty ship carried it. If a Liberty ship could not carry it, the thing was probably too large to exist. The loading of a Liberty ship was an art that the Army's port battalions refined over the course of the war. The 5 cargo holds had to be loaded in a sequence that balanced the ship fore and aft and maintained stability. Heavy cargo, tanks, locomotives, steel plate, went in the bottom of the holds, with lighter material stacked above. Vehicles were driven onto the deck and lashed down with chains and turnbuckles. Ammunition was stored in the lowest holds, below the waterline, where a torpedo hit was slightly less likely. Gasoline, the most dangerous cargo, was carried in drums on deck when possible, so that a fire could be jettisoned rather than fought. The merchant mariners who crewed these ships were not military personnel. They were civilian sailors employed by the War Shipping Administration, sailing under the authority of the United States Merchant Marine. They were volunteers in the strictest sense. No one was drafted into the Merchant Marine. They sailed because the work was there, the pay was reasonable, bonuses were paid for sailing in war zones and carrying hazardous cargo, and someone had to do it. The mortality rate among merchant mariners was higher than in any branch of the armed forces except the Marine Corps. 1 in 26 merchant mariners died during the war, a rate of 3.9%, which exceeded the Army, 2.8%, the Navy, 1.7%, and the Coast Guard. They died when their ships were torpedoed by U-boats, bombed by Condor aircraft, struck by mines in harbor approaches, or caught in the kamikaze attacks of the Pacific. They died in the freezing water of the North Atlantic, where a man without a life suit survived for minutes, not hours. They died in the burning oil that spread from a torpedoed tanker, coating the surface of the sea with flame. They died in the ammunition explosions that consumed entire ships in seconds, leaving nothing, no wreckage, no bodies, no evidence that the ship had ever existed. They received no military benefits, no veteran status, no GI Bill, no access to VA hospitals, and no recognition from the government until 1988, when Congress finally granted them veteran classification, 43 years after the war ended. By then, most of them were dead. The recognition came too late for the men who had earned it, which was, in the bitter judgment of the surviving merchant mariners, exactly what they had expected from a government that had been happy to use them and reluctant to acknowledge them. The Liberty ships carried these men across every ocean. The ships were slow, uncomfortable, and, as the cracking problem demonstrated, occasionally fragile. The crews called them Kaiser's coffins, which was unfair to Kaiser and only somewhat unfair to the ships. Most Liberty ships survived the war. Of the 2,710 built, only about 200 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of roughly 7%. The remaining 93% delivered their cargo, returned for more, and delivered again, voyage after voyage, convoy after convoy, until the war was won. Kaiser did not stop at cargo ships. When he saw a need that the existing military-industrial structure was not filling, he filled it himself, and he did it by going over the heads of the admirals who told him no. In 1942, Kaiser proposed building escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys across the Atlantic, providing air cover against U-boats and long-range bombers. The Navy was skeptical. Escort carriers were being produced by converting existing cargo hulls at an established East Coast shipyard, and the Navy's Bureau of Ships saw no need for additional production. Kaiser argued that the existing program was too slow and that he could build carriers from scratch, not conversions, but purpose-built warships in his Vancouver, Washington shipyard. The Navy said no. The Bureau of Ships said no. The admirals said a dam builder from Oakland had no business proposing warship construction to the United States Navy. Kaiser went to President Roosevelt. He made his case directly to the commander-in-chief, bypassing the entire naval establishment. Roosevelt, who understood both the U-boat threat and the value of a man who could build things faster than anyone else in America, overruled the Navy and gave Kaiser a contract for 50 escort carriers. The admirals were furious. They had been outmaneuvered by a civilian who had gone over their heads to the White House. Kaiser built the carriers at his Vancouver, Washington shipyard. They were small, 512 feet long, displacing roughly 11,000 tons, carrying roughly 28 aircraft each. They were called baby flat tops by the fleet and Kaiser coffins by critics who questioned their seaworthiness and survivability. The critics were proved spectacularly wrong. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, a group of escort carriers designated Taffy III, operating off the Philippine island of Samar, was caught by a powerful Japanese surface force that included the battleship Yamato, 4 heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers. The escort carriers, designed to hunt submarines and provide air cover for convoys, were not built for surface combat. They had no armor. Their single 5-inch guns were designed for anti-aircraft defense, not for engaging battleships. They were outgunned by an absurd margin. Taffy III fought anyway. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had. Their destroyer escorts attacked the Japanese heavy cruisers in series of suicidal torpedo runs. The carriers made smoke, zigzagged, and absorbed hits that would have sunk more fragile vessels. Several of the escort carriers in the engagement, including USS Gambier Bay, which was sunk, were built in Kaiser's yards. The battle off Samar became one of the most celebrated naval actions in American history. The baby flat tops that the Navy had not wanted proved in 3 hours of desperate combat that Kaiser had been right and the admirals had been wrong. Kaiser also built landing ship tanks, the flat-bottomed vessels that carried tanks and vehicles directly onto invasion beaches. He built troop transports, fleet oilers, and ammunition ships. By the end of the war, his yards had produced more than a quarter of all American ships built during the conflict. Germany could not replicate what Kaiser achieved. Japan could not. No nation on earth could, because no other nation possessed the combination of industrial capacity, raw material abundance, managerial innovation, and sheer continental scale that the United States brought to the shipbuilding problem. Germany's shipyards were being bombed. The yards at Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel, which produced both U-boats and surface vessels, were targeted repeatedly by RAF Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force. Every raid that damaged a slipway or destroyed a machine shop reduced German shipbuilding capacity by an increment that could not be recovered. Japan's shipyards were being bombed from mid-1944 onward, and even before the bombing began, Japanese merchant ship construction was constrained by steel shortages, labor shortages, and the diversion of industrial capacity to warship construction. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943, the peak year of Liberty ship production, American shipyards launched over 19 million tons of merchant shipping. Germany, in the same year, launched approximately 300,000 tons of merchant shipping, less than 2% of the American total. Japan launched somewhat more, but its merchant fleet was shrinking because American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese yards could replace them. The mirror image of the Atlantic tonnage war, with the roles reversed. Kaiser understood the mathematics instinctively because his career had taught him the same lesson in concrete. You do not build a dam by sculpting each block to perfection. You pour concrete in volume as fast as the forms can hold it, and you build something that works. The Liberty ship was the dam-building philosophy applied to the ocean. Simple design, maximum volume, adequate performance, overwhelming quantity. The German U-boat commanders could sink ships. They sank hundreds, but they could not sink the shipyards. And the shipyards, running at Kaiser's pace, replaced every loss and then some. By mid-1943, the tonnage curve crossed. New construction exceeded losses for the first time, and it never crossed back. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not only by the destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that hunted the U-boats, though they contributed mightily. It was won by the shipyards that built ships faster than the submarines could sink them. And the man who built those shipyards was a man who had never built a ship before the war started. When the war ended, the Liberty ships were surplus. Thousands of them, the largest fleet of identical ships ever built, sitting in harbors and anchorages from Norfolk to San Francisco, their cargo holds empty, their engines cooling, their usefulness evaporating with every month of peace. The government sold them for scrap, transferred them to Allied nations under the Marshall Plan, converted some for civilian use as tramp steamers and bulk carriers, or mothballed them in reserve fleets, long rows of gray hulls anchored in protected waterways, the National Defense Reserve Fleet, maintained at minimal readiness in case another emergency required them. The mothball fleets were eerie places. Hundreds of ships anchored bow to stern, their portholes sealed, their engines preserved in cosmoline, their decks accumulating bird droppings and rust, manned by skeleton caretaker crews who pumped bilges and checked moorings and wondered if the ships would ever sail again. Some were reactivated for Korea, a few for Vietnam. Most never moved again and were eventually towed to the breakers and cut apart. Kaiser himself moved on with the restless energy that had defined his entire career. He entered automobile manufacturing, producing the Kaiser and Fraser cars that competed, unsuccessfully as it turned out, with the Big Three of Detroit. The cars were well-designed but underfunded, and Kaiser lacked the dealer network and brand loyalty that General Motors and Ford had built over decades. He tried aluminum production, cement, real estate development in Hawaii, and resort construction. The Kaiser Permanente Health Plan, born in the shipyards, grew into the largest non-profit healthcare organization in the United States. Henry J. Kaiser died in 1967 at the age of 85 in Honolulu, having built dams, roads, ships, cars, hospitals, houses, and cities, and having failed at just enough of them to prove that he was human. The Liberty ships faded from public memory. They were ugly, they were slow, they were obsolete the day the war ended, superseded by the faster Victory ships and then by modern diesel-powered cargo vessels that made the triple expansion steam engine seem as quaint as a stagecoach. Nobody romanticized a Liberty ship the way they romanticized a Spitfire or a B-17 or a Sherman tank. The ships had no glamour, they had no personality. They were mass-produced tools, identical to each other, interchangeable, disposable, the paper cups of the maritime world. But they won the war not by fighting, though some of them did fight, including the SS Stephen Hopkins, which on September 27, 1942, became the only American merchant ship to sink a German surface combatant during the war. The Hopkins, armed with a single 4-inch stern gun and two 37mm bow guns, engaged the armed raider Steer and the blockade runner Tannenfels in the South Atlantic. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The Hopkins cadet engineer Edwin O'Hara continued to fire the stern gun alone after the rest of the gun crew was killed, scoring hits on the steer that set her ablaze. The Hopkins sank. O'Hara was killed. The steer was so badly damaged that her own crew scuttled her. O'Hara was posthumously awarded the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal, one of many decorations that the public never heard of for a service that the public never recognized. The Liberty ships won the war by carrying it, by moving the mountains of material that a global war consumed, the tanks, the ammunition, the fuel, the food, the medicine, the spare parts, the replacement, everything, from the factories of America to the beaches of Normandy, the docks of Murmansk, the harbors of Australia, the anchorages of the Pacific Islands. Without the Liberty ships, the armies did not eat. Without the Liberty ships, the tanks did not have fuel. Without the Liberty ships, the guns did not have shells. Without the Liberty ships, the war was lost. 2 Liberty ships survive in operational condition. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is moored at Pier 35 in San Francisco. The SS John W. Brown is in Baltimore Harbor. Both are museum ships maintained by volunteers, occasionally taken to sea for commemorative voyages. If you visit the Jeremiah O'Brien, and you should if you are ever in San Francisco, you can walk through the cargo holds, stand on the bridge, and descend into the engine room where the triple expansion steam engine still turns. The engine is enormous. 3 cylinders, high pressure, intermediate pressure, low pressure, arranged in a row, each one driving a crank on the propeller shaft. The design is from the 1880s. It was obsolete before the First World War, and it powered 2,700 ships across every ocean in the Second. Stand in that engine room and listen. The engine, when it runs, makes a sound that is unlike any modern machine, a deep, rhythmic, reciprocating thump that you feel in your feet and your chest before you hear it in your ears. It is the sound of the 19th century moving a 20th century war. It is the sound of simplicity defeating sophistication, of quantity overwhelming quality, of a dam builder from New York proving that the admirals were wrong. Henry Kaiser was not a genius in the conventional sense. He did not invent anything, he did not design anything, he did not discover anything. What he did was simpler and, in the context of the war, more important. He looked at a problem that the experts said was intractable. How do you build ships faster than submarines can sink them? And he answered it with methods borrowed from highway construction and dam building: prefabrication, modular assembly, parallel production, welding instead of riveting, mass training instead of apprenticeship, volume instead of craft. The experts said it couldn't be done. Kaiser did it. The ships cracked, and he fixed the cracking. The Navy rejected his carriers, and Roosevelt overruled the Navy. The traditional shipbuilders despised him, and he outproduced all of them combined. 2,710 Liberty ships, 1,490 vessels from Kaiser's yards alone, 1 ship per day at peak production, 4 days and 15 hours for the fastest, 200 lost to enemy action, 2,500 still floating when the war ended, each one carrying 10,000 tons of the material that armies eat and burn and shoot and wear. The most important ship in World War II was not a battleship, it was not a carrier, it was not a submarine. It was a slow, ugly, mass-produced cargo ship powered by an engine from the 1880s, designed by British engineers, built by a man who had never built a ship, crewed by civilians who received no veteran status for 43 years, and named after a revolutionary who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." They gave the world liberty. They gave 9,521 merchant mariners death, and the ships that carried both were built by a man the Navy refused to listen to, until the ocean was full of them and the war was won and the admirals had nothing left to say.